Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This audio uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today we're going to dive deep into Stanley Karnow's Vietnam, a history. It's this, really insightful look at the Vietnam War. And we've got excerpts and key takeaways from the book. We're going to help you uncover the real story behind this pivotal moment in history. You'll see this is so much more than battles and dates.
It really is about the people, the decisions, and the lasting consequences. Karnow was actually a journalist during the war, so he brings this immediacy and this human element that you just don't often find in dry historical accounts.
Yeah, that's what really struck me too, especially when he talks about the human cost of the war. He doesn't shy away from the brutality, both physical and psychological. Like, he shares this chilling anecdote about Colonel Boutin, a North Vietnamese officer, who survived over 20 B-52 bombing raids. Imagine the sheer terror of those attacks, the constant threat of annihilation, and the mental fortitude it must have taken to endure that.
And those scars, both visible and invisible, they ran deep throughout Vietnamese society. Karnow talks about the villagers who hid for years, bearing the physical and emotional wounds of napalm attacks. This wasn't just a war fought on battlefields. It was a war that seeped into the very fabric of life.
It's heavy stuff, for sure. And it makes you question the justifications for the war. You mentioned that Karnow presents these different perspectives. What did those look like?
Well, you see this clash between those who believed victory was possible and those who came to question the entire endeavor. General Westmoreland, for example, argues that a lack of public support back home really hampered the U.S. effort. But then you have Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense, later admitting his own, grave errors in judgment.
So, fighting a war on two fronts, one in the jungles of Vietnam and another in the court of public opinion back home. This Vietnam syndrome, as it came to be known, cast a long shadow on U.S. foreign policy, influencing decisions for decades to come.
Exactly. And it's fascinating how Karnow doesn't just center the American experience. He dives into the Vietnamese perspective, too, offering a stark reality check about what victory actually looked like for them.
I'm guessing it wasn't all parades and celebrations.
Far from it. We hear from Prime Minister Pham Van Dong, who admits the devastating consequences of some of the communists' post-war policies, like the land reform campaign. That ultimately eroded trust within communities.
It's a reminder that winning a war doesn't automatically translate to peace or prosperity. Sometimes the aftermath can be just as brutal as the conflict itself.
Absolutely. And to understand how all of this unfolded, we need to go back to the beginning, to the rise of a figure who would come to define the Vietnamese struggle, Ho Chi Minh.
What was his story? What drove him to become such a powerful revolutionary leader?
His life is incredibly interesting. Karnow traces his journey from his early days to his transformation into a revolutionary. We learn about his time in Paris, engaging in activism and shaping his ideology. We see his cunning, his pragmatism, and his ability to forge alliances and navigate complex political landscapes.
Wait, Ho Chi Minh was in Paris. That's not something you usually associate with a Vietnamese revolutionary.
Right. It shows his remarkable adaptability and how his vision extended far beyond the borders of Vietnam. He wasn't just fighting for independence, he was challenging the entire colonial system.
And this fight, as we know, became intertwined with a much larger global conflict. How does Karnow frame the international forces that pulled Vietnam into the vortex of war?
He shows how the U.S., initially supporting the French in their attempt to reassert colonial control, gradually got sucked deeper and deeper into the conflict. The domino theory played a huge role here, the fear that if Vietnam fell to communism, other Southeast Asian nations would follow.
So, this fear, fueled by Cold War anxieties, led to a series of escalating commitments, and ultimately, a full-blown war.
Exactly. It's a story of miscalculations, shifting alliances, and the unintended consequences of trying to control the tides of history. The U.S., China, the Soviet Union, they were all players in this game, each with their own agendas and ambitions.
Okay, so we have the players, the motivations, the international context, but what about the pivotal moments, those turning points that changed the course of the war?
Well, one that stands out is the Battle of Diem, which marked the end of French colonial rule in Vietnam.
That's the one where the Viet Minh surrounded the French, right?
Exactly. This decisive victory forced the French to the negotiating table and eventually led to the Geneva Accords, which temporarily divided Vietnam. Then you have the rise and fall of Ngo Dinh, the first president of South Vietnam.
Diem was heavily backed by the U.S., wasn't he?
He was, but his regime was plagued by corruption, instability, and brutal crackdowns on dissent. It was a stark illustration of how the U.S., despite its good intentions, often struggled to understand the complexities of Vietnamese politics and culture.
This reminds me of that haunting image of the Buddhist monk setting himself on fire in protest of Diem's regime.
Yes, a powerful symbol of the resistance brewing beneath the surface. But we're talking turning points. We can't forget the Tet Offensive in 1968.
Wasn't this a huge turning point, both militarily and in terms of how the war was perceived back home?
Absolutely. It was a series of surprise attacks by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces across South Vietnam. It showed that the war was far from over and raised serious doubts about the U.S.'s ability to win, despite their military superiority.
So, a tactical defeat for the communists, but a strategic victory.
Precisely. It shattered the illusion of progress and exposed the brutality of the war on a massive scale. And then, of course, you have the Hue Massacre, a dark chapter in the war's already tragic narrative.
Thousands of civilians killed by the communists.
Yes. The Hue Massacre fueled the growing anti-war sentiment in the U.S., further eroding public support for the conflict.
So how did the U.S. eventually extricate itself from this quagmire? What was the path to withdrawal?
Well, it was a long and complicated process. You have President Johnson's escalation of the war, including the controversial Gulf of Tonkin incident, which turned out to be based on faulty information, but was used to justify a massive increase in U.S. military involvement.
I remember reading about that. It was a real turning point in the war's trajectory.
Indeed. And as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, domestic opposition grew, fueled by events like the Tet Offensive and the relentless media coverage that brought the horrors of war into American living rooms every night. This growing dissent set the stage for Nixon's entrance and his Vietnamization strategy.
Right. His plan was to gradually withdraw U.S. troops while transferring the burden of fighting to the South Vietnamese army, correct?
Yes. But it was a difficult and ultimately unsuccessful strategy. He also authorized the controversial bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos, trying to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Trying to achieve peace with honor, as he put it. But ultimately, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, and the U.S. withdrew its troops in 1973.
Yes. But the accords were fragile, and the fighting continued. The war continued between the North and the South, and in 1975, Saigon fell to the communists, effectively ending the war and reunifying the country under communist rule.
A chaotic and tragic event, mass evacuations, a sense of abandonment for those who had sided with the South.
It was a dramatic end to a long and bloody conflict. Karnow vividly captures the chaos and despair of those final days, but he also hints at the resilience of the Vietnamese people and their determination to rebuild their shattered nation.
This has been such an insightful look into Vietnam, a history, so much more than just a dry historical account.
It really is. Karnow challenges us to confront the complexities of war, the human costs, the political miscalculations, and the enduring consequences. It's a story that goes beyond simple narratives of victory and defeat, forcing us to grapple with the enduring moral and political dilemmas of the Vietnam War.
So what's the one thing you'd want our listener to take away from Karnow's work?
That history is never as simple as it seems. To truly understand the Vietnam War, you need to see it from multiple perspectives, to appreciate the human stories woven into the fabric of conflict.
Vietnam. A history is definitely a book that stays with you. If you're looking for a deeper understanding of this pivotal moment in history, you should absolutely check it out. We'll put a link to purchase the book in the show notes.
And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more insightful deep dives. We'll be right back with more from Vietnam. A history after a short break. We were just talking about the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War. But as Karnow shows us, the story doesn't end there. The war may be over, but the struggle for Vietnam's future was far from settled.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine what it must have been like for the people who were left behind, those who had sided with the South Vietnamese government. What happened to them?
Well, for many, it was a brutal transition. Karnow details the re-education camps, the economic hardships, the suppression of dissent that characterized the post-war period. It's a reminder that regime change, even in the name of unification, often comes at a steep price.
So the war may have ended, but the fight for Vietnam continued, just on a different battleground. It wasn't just about political control, was it? It was about reshaping society, imposing a new ideology, a new way of life.
Exactly. And that reshaping touched the lives of millions of individuals. What's powerful about Karnow's book is that he doesn't just give us the bird's eye view of history. He zooms in on the personal stories, the human faces behind the sweeping narratives.
Like Colonel Bhutan, the North Vietnamese officer who survived those countless B-52 bombing raids. What became of him after the war?
His story is a fascinating one. He remained a communist, but he became increasingly disillusioned with the party's policies and the direction of the country.
Almost like the war,
Yep.
which he fought so fiercely for, ultimately led him to question the very cause he championed.
In a way, yes. He eventually defected to the West and became a vocal critic of the Vietnamese government. His story is a powerful testament to how war can warp even the most fervent beliefs.
It underscores that lasting impact of war, how it can leave deep scars, not just on individuals, but on an entire nation.
One of the most valuable aspects of Karnow's work is that he forces us to confront the human dimension of the Vietnam War, to see beyond the political rhetoric, and grasp the magnitude of suffering it inflicted on all sides.
And Karnow doesn't shy away from examining how we got there, does he? He really delves into the motivations and miscalculations of both the U.S. and Vietnam.
He does. He looks at the domino theory, the Cold War anxieties, the political pressures that shaped U.S. policy in Vietnam. He analyzes the personalities and decisions of key figures, like Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, showing how their actions, sometimes driven by ego, sometimes by fear, had ripple effects across the globe.
It's amazing how these individual personalities can have such a profound impact on the course of history.
It's a reminder that history isn't just a series of inevitable events. It's also the product of human choices, both brilliant and disastrous. And in the case of Vietnam, there were certainly many miscalculations along the way.
Like the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is used to justify a massive escalation of the war, even though it was based on faulty information. A blatant manipulation of the truth to serve political ends.
Exactly. And then there's the bombing campaign, intended to cripple North Vietnam's ability to wage war, but ultimately proving ineffective and wreaking havoc on the civilian population. Karnow dissects these decisions, exposing the flawed assumptions, the internal debates, and the unintended consequences.
It highlights that constant tension between military strategy and political reality, the struggle to balance competing interests and objectives.
And in the case of Vietnam, that struggle often led to frustration, disillusionment, and ultimately a sense of futility.
So having analyzed the U.S.'s involvement in such depth, what would you say are the key takeaways? What lessons can we learn from this conflict, even decades later?
I think one of the most important lessons is the danger of hubris. The U.S. went into Vietnam believing it could easily defeat a smaller, less developed country. They underestimated the Vietnamese people's determination, resilience, and willingness to fight for their independence no matter the cost.
It's a classic case of underestimating your opponent, of failing to grasp the complexities of a different culture and a different way of waging war.
Absolutely. And I think another crucial lesson is the importance of domestic support for any military intervention. As the war dragged on, public opinion turned against it, fueled by media coverage, and a growing awareness of the war's brutality. This made it increasingly difficult for U.S. policymakers to justify their continued involvement.
It's like there were two wars being fought simultaneously, one on the battlefields of Vietnam and another in the hearts and minds of the American people.
That's a great way to put it. And ultimately, the loss of public support played a major role in the U.S.'s decision to withdraw.
So far, we've mostly focused on the American experience. But Karnow doesn't just tell one side of the story. He also offers valuable insights into the motivations and experiences of the Vietnamese people, both North and South.
That's what makes his book so powerful. He goes beyond simplistic narratives of good guys versus bad guys and shows us the complexities of the conflict from multiple angles.
He talks about the devastating impact of the war on both North and South Vietnam, the millions of lives lost, the environmental destruction, the social and economic upheaval that touched every aspect of life.
He also explores the divisions within Vietnamese society,
Yeah.
regional rivalries, political factions, religious differences, all of which were exacerbated by the war.
And he doesn't shy away from examining the harsh realities of life under the communist regime, the land reform campaign, the re-education camps, the suppression of dissent.
He presents a balanced and nuanced view of the Vietnamese experience, acknowledging the sacrifices made by both sides and the tragic consequences of the war for all involved.
It sounds like Karnow's Vietnam, a history, is a truly comprehensive exploration of a war that continues to resonate with us today.
It is. It's a challenging read, but an essential one for anyone who wants to understand the complexities of war, the human costs, and the enduring search for peace and reconciliation.
Absolutely. We'll be sure to include a link to purchase the book in the show notes. for our listeners who want to delve deeper into this history.
And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more insightful deep dives. We'll be back after a short break to continue our exploration of Vietnam, a history. We've been examining the Vietnam War from all these angles, the politics, the strategies, the just devastating consequences. But at the heart of it all are the Vietnamese people themselves. And I think Karnow does a remarkable job of bringing their voices to the forefront.
Yeah, he doesn't just recount these events. He shares their personal stories, their experiences, their struggles, their hopes. It makes the history so much more tangible, so much more human.
Yeah, he interviewed countless Vietnamese people, from high-ranking officials and soldiers to ordinary villagers, caught in the crossfires through their firsthand accounts, that we really grasp the profound impact of this war on individuals, families, entire communities.
You mentioned earlier the story of Bo, that former Viet Minh fighter who stayed behind in the South after the Geneva Accords. His story seems to just encapsulate so much of what we've been discussing.
Yeah, Bo, he really embodies the resilience and determination of the Vietnamese people. They're just unwavering commitment to their beliefs, even in the face of incredible hardship.
Yeah.
He represents those caught between the ideologies of North and South, forced to make these impossible choices and live with the consequences.
It really highlights that fact that war creates these moral gray areas, these complexities that defy easy categorization. It forces individuals to confront their own values and make these agonizing decisions.
And Karnow doesn't shy away from exploring those complexities. He delves into the divisions within Vietnamese society, the tensions between those who supported the communists and those who opposed them.
It challenges that simplistic narrative of a unified nation fighting for a singular cause.
Exactly. He reveals the nuances of the conflict, showing how the war ripped through the very fabric of Vietnamese society, leaving lasting scars on families and communities long after the fighting ceased.
And it wasn't just men who suffered. Karnow highlights the vital role women played throughout the war.
Absolutely. Women were active participants in the Viet Cong, serving as guerrillas, spies, providing logistical support. They also endured tremendous hardship, experiencing displacement, violence, the loss of loved ones. Their stories are often overlooked in these traditional war narratives, but Karnow brings them to the forefront.
It underscores that war affects everyone, regardless of gender, age, or social status. It touches every aspect of life, leaving behind a legacy of pain, loss, and trauma that can take generations to heal.
And that brings us to the question of legacy. What is the lasting impact of the Vietnam War, both on Vietnam itself and its relationship with the world?
It's a question that continues to resonate, even today, decades after the fall of Saigon.
The war left profound scars on Vietnam, both physically and psychologically. The country was devastated by years of fighting, and the echoes of that conflict are still felt today.
It's a reminder that the wounds of war run deep and can take generations to heal.
It took decades for Vietnam to begin rebuilding, to reconcile its divided past, and to re-engage with the world. But amidst the pain and loss, there's also this powerful sense of resilience, a determination to move forward, to create a better future.
Karnow captures that spirit in his book. He doesn't just dwell on the darkness. He also highlights the potential for healing, for growth, for a future where the echoes of war no longer define a nation's identity.
Vietnam. A history is a challenging read, but it's also an incredibly insightful and rewarding one. It's a book that forces us to confront the complexities of war, to empathize with those who suffered, and to learn from the mistakes of the past.
Absolutely. If you're looking for a deeper understanding of this pivotal moment in history, we highly recommend diving into Karnow's work. Be sure to check out the link to purchase the book in our show notes.
And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking deep dives into the books that shape our understanding of the world.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through Vietnam, a history